Hello YouTube! In this video we're going to look at a famous argument from Hilary Putnam that attempts to refute skepticism by showing that certain skeptical scenarios are inconceivable. So a standard skeptical argument asks you to consider the possibility that you are really a brain in a vat, that all of your perceptual experiences are produced by a very sophisticated machine that is stimulating your brain in just the right kind of way to create the illusion of an external world. So right now I seem to have a body, I seem to be sitting on a chair in my bedroom looking at a computer, but all of these appearances, all of these perceptual appearances are compatible with my brain actually being in a vat. So in the brain in a vat scenario, the vast majority of my beliefs about the world are false. And so we can state a kind of standard skeptical argument like this. Premise 1, if I don't know that I'm not a brain in a vat, then I don't know that I have hands. Premise 2, I don't know I'm not a brain in a vat, so conclusion, I don't know that I have hands. And of course, you know, all my other beliefs about the way the external world is will go the same way. So Hilary Putnam, in his article Brains in a Vat, argues that, in fact, the brain in a vat scenario is not really possible. So we should certainly reject premise 2. I do know that I'm not a brain in a vat, and you know that you're not a brain in a vat. It could not possibly be the case that I am a brain in a vat. Now, of course, before we get into this, a quick advert. If you like my channel, you can support me either on Patreon or give me a donation on PayPal. I offer private tutoring in philosophy. Please email me if you're interested. And of course, I have a Discord. If you want to talk about this topic or any other philosophical topics, check that out. Okay, so let's get started. Now, a first point to bear in mind about Putnam's argument is that he wasn't primarily interested in giving an argument against skepticism. So this kind of anti-skeptical argument is really just sort of one step in a broader argument against a position that he calls metaphysical realism. So actually what Putnam is doing is he's arguing for a position called internal realism over metaphysical realism. But, you know, I mean, we're going to look specifically at the sort of anti-skeptical part of his argument. But it's just worth bearing in mind that Putnam's goal really wasn't necessarily to refute skepticism. He was doing something else. But a lot of people have taken Putnam's argument as an argument against skepticism, and so that's how we'll look at it here. Okay, so Putnam's argument draws on notions of language, meaning, and reference, and essentially what he's going to do is he's going to argue that once we see how it is that words and concepts come to refer to things, it will become clear that the skeptical hypothesis, the brain in the vat hypothesis, is unstateable. So we can begin with this question. How exactly does one thing come to refer to or represent something else? So I take it that, you know, the words Winston Churchill, right? The words Winston Churchill represent the person Winston Churchill. They refer to Winston Churchill. Or this photograph that you see on the screen here, this represents Winston Churchill. So the words Winston Churchill and the image on the screen here, they are representing or referring to Winston Churchill. So the question is, how is this possible? How is it the case that a mere set of physical marks comes to be about something? Well, one thing we should notice is that resemblance is neither necessary nor sufficient for representation. It's not necessary because the words Winston Churchill, I mean, they refer to Winston Churchill, but obviously they don't resemble Winston Churchill. I mean, they don't resemble him in any way, right? They're just words. Winston Churchill was a person. Moreover, resemblance is not sufficient for representation. Putnam asks us to imagine an ant walking across a patch of sand. And just by chance, the line that the ant traces in the sand ends up looking like Winston Churchill. Now the question is, has this ant drawn a picture of Winston Churchill? A picture that depicts or represents Winston Churchill? Well, Putnam thinks not. The ant has never seen Winston Churchill, it has never seen a picture of Winston Churchill, it has no intention of depicting Winston Churchill. It has no intention of depicting anything. The resemblance occurred purely by chance. So we see certain similarities between the line that the ant traced and the way that Winston Churchill looked, but I mean, that line is not itself a representation of anything. So One natural thought here is, well, representation must be a matter of intention. If the ant had seen Winston Churchill and had intended to draw a picture of him, then the line drawing would represent Churchill. So the physical lines in the sand do not in themselves represent anything, right? There's nothing intrinsic to the line in the sand that makes it representational. In order for that line in the sand to represent Churchill, the ant must be able to think about Churchill and it must intend to represent Churchill. So it must have a mental representation of Churchill. Now, the problem here is that this appeal to mental representation just pushes the problem one step back. Because if it's the case that physical objects do not in themselves represent anything, well, how can thoughts and ideas, how can those in themselves represent anything? I mean, the question that we're really asking here is, how do we get representation in the first place? As Putnam puts it, how can thought reach out and grasp what is external? So, okay, so like physical objects, the physical things that we take as being representations, you know, words and pictures and so on, they have no intrinsic connection to the things they purportedly represent. You know, the line drawing has no intrinsic connection to Winston Churchill. But the same is true for mental representations, at least according to Putnam. Mental representations have no intrinsic connection to the things that they represent. So consider, for instance, mental images. Putnam asks us to imagine a planet on which creatures evolved that are just like human beings, but nobody on this planet has ever seen or imagined trees. One day, a spaceship passes by their planet and it happens to drop a picture that resembles a tree. And in fact, we can suppose that no mental representation was involved at any point in the creation of the picture. Maybe it was accidentally created by spilled paints, and the paint just happened to, you know, fall in a pattern that resembled what we would call a tree. So the spaceship drops this picture on a planet, no other contact with the spaceship is had. The aliens on this planet see the picture, they wonder what it is. Of course, they never understand that it is a tree. Now, here's the thought. When I look at this picture, I might say, oh, that represents a tree. And what's happening there, of course, is that I have some mental representation of a tree, and my mental representation is, like, I don't know, activated in some sense by this picture. So when I, think about trees, I kind of have a mental image. I have a picture in my mind's eye that sort of copies the appearance of a tree. And I take that mental image to be a representation of a tree. Now, we can suppose that one of the denizens of the alien world, on observing this drawing or this, spilled paint picture that's dropped from the spacecraft, she forms a mental image that is identical to my mental image. But her mental image, unlike mine, is not a representation of a tree. Instead, it represents a strange drawing, or it represents an unknown object, or whatever. But it doesn't represent a tree. Okay, so like when I have a mental image of a tree, I get like a little picture in my mind's eye that is identical to what she gets in her mind's eye. But my picture in my head, that represents a tree. Her picture does not represent a tree. And so then the thought is, well, what goes for pictures and mental images also goes for words and thoughts. No word in itself represents anything. Monkeys randomly hitting keys on typewriters for a long enough time, they will eventually produce what we would interpret as a perfect written description of trees. A person on another planet could read these words, memorize them, think about them, and recite them. But when the person on the other planet reads these words, those words are not going to refer to trees. So the basic point then is that no mental representation, no symbol, has any intrinsic connection to what it represents. No mental entity, no entity of any kind, considered just in itself, can represent anything else. So just by stipulation, my mental image of a tree and the mental image in the mind's eye of the person on the alien world, those images are qualitatively identical, but my mental image is an image of a tree, and the alien's mental image is not. So Putnam concludes that in order to have representation or reference, there has to be some sort of causal relation. So he endorses a kind of causal constraint on reference. So here's how it's summarized from the Internet Encyclopedia of Philosophy. The causal constraint says, a term refers to an object only if there is an appropriate causal connection between that term and the object. Now, I mean, obviously this is quite vague. We don't really need to fill in the details here in order to understand Putnam's argument. I mean, so of course we can ask, like, well, you know, what exactly counts as an appropriate causal connection? We can leave that fairly open. The important point is there has to be some causal connection with, you know, so with the word tree, certain events prompt my usage of that word. And, you know, my usage of that word in various contexts prompts certain behaviors with respect to external objects. So, you know, if I say, for instance, let's say I'm, you know, wandering around my garden, and, you know, I look at a tree, and I say, oh, that tree is getting too large, we need to cut it down. Well, what's happening here is, like, you know, I have an interaction with an external object. I'm seeing a particular object, it's making me feel certain ways, then I enact certain types of behavior with respect to that object. And so there's these causal interactions between me and the object and the words that I use. And what makes it the case that the word tree refers to trees is that there are these causal interactions between the word tree and the trees themselves. So, I mean, I guess to put it more simply, like, if you take my mental image of a tree, well, my mental image represents trees because this mental image was caused by my perception of trees. The alien's mental image can't be about trees because, you know, the alien has had no causal connection to trees. Now, what this causal constraint tells us is that reference cannot be intrinsic, or as Putnam puts it, magical. Reference can't be magical. Words and concepts refer to things in virtue of their relations to those things, not in virtue of anything intrinsic to the word or concept. And so this view is known as semantic externalism. The idea is that the meaning of a word or the meaning of a concept is fixed by factors that are external to the speaker. Okay, so that's the sort of view of reference that Putnam adopts. So let's turn then to the brain in the vat scenario. So as Putnam tells it, we can imagine that, you know, imagine that everybody is a brain in a vat hooked up to a supercomputer that creates the illusion of the real world. Putnam grants that this scenario does not violate any physical laws. So in some sense, there is a possible world in which this scenario obtains. Like, there could, so we can say, well, maybe there's a world where all the inhabitants are just brains in vats, and where they have the same sorts of experiences that we do. But according to Putnam, we cannot think or say that this scenario is actually true. So we can't think that we are in this scenario. Maybe we can think that other people are in the scenario, but we can't think that we are in the scenario. So, like, I might be able to think that somebody else is a brain in a vat, but I can't think that I am a brain in a vat. And indeed, to suppose that this scenario is true is Putnam's, according to Putnam, it's self-refuting in a certain sense. It's not possible that I am a brain in a vat. Okay, so why is this? Well, okay, consider the possible world where everybody's a brain in a vat. These brains in vats are conscious, they're intelligent. We can stipulate that these brains in vats are stimulated to have exactly the same sensory experiences that we do. In fact, you know, we can just stipulate that the brain states of these brains in vats are exactly the same as our brain states. So they're, like, identical in terms of the kind of physical states of the brain and in terms of their mental experiences. But now consider what happens when these brains in vats talk about things, or when they think about things. So, you know, when let's say one of them thinks there is a tree in front of me. Okay, so one of these brains in vats has a sort of tree-like appearance, and it says, oh, there's a tree in front of me. Well, what does this mean? So clearly, when a brain in a vat says there is a tree in front of me, there is no connection between her word tree and actual trees. Her words, her thoughts, her mental images, they may be qualitatively identical with my words, thoughts and mental images, but we've seen that qualitative identity is not enough for reference. So as Putnam puts it, and I quote, "The brains in a vat are not thinking about real trees when they think there is a tree in front of me, because there is nothing by virtue of which their thought tree represents actual trees. So remember, in order for a word to refer to a tree, there has to be some appropriate connection between, the word and then the non-verbal inputs and outputs and things going on in the world. But there's no connection between the brain in the vat's word tree and trees, right? At least trees in the sense of like actual trees, like biological organisms. So when the brain in the vat thinks there is a tree in front of me, she's not referring to trees. Now, what does she refer to? There's different things we could say here. We might say that she refers to trees in the image, to a particular succession of sensory experiences. Or we might say that she refers to the electronic impulses that cause tree-like experiences. Or maybe she refers to particular features of the supercomputer's program. But either way, what's causing her to employ the word tree it's not trees, right? Trees are not playing that causal role. Now, what this means is that the brain in the vat is speaking a different language to us. She's speaking Vat English or Vatlish. She's not speaking English. Now, Vatlish obviously looks and sounds identical to English. If we had sort of the ability of telepathy and we could see into each other's minds, if we could see into the mind of the brain in the vat, then everything going on in her mind would be understandable to us. We would say, "Oh, that's English," like she's thinking English thoughts. But actually, no, right? So the Vatlish looks and sounds identical to English, but there are significant differences in the meanings of the terms. Moreover, when the brain in the vat thinks the words, "There is a tree in front of me," this sentence is actually true. So in Vatlish, a word like tree and phrases like in front of, they refer to certain patterns of electronic impulses. There is a tree in front of me is true just in case the patterns of electronic impulses that normally produce tree-like experiences are occurring. And as it happens, those patterns are occurring, right? That's just sort of by stipulation, right? Like we're just stipulating that the supercomputer is it's producing the electronic impulses that stimulate her brain in such a way as to create these tree-like appearances. So the right-hand side of this biconditional is satisfied, so the sentence is true. Her statement is true. It is true that there's a tree in front of her, in terms of what the words like tree mean in Vatlish. Now, of course, the same point can be made for all other, words that we would use to refer to objects. So the word brain in Vatlish, that doesn't refer to brains, it refers to brains in the image, or patterns of electronic impulses that produce brain-like appearances. Vat in Vatlish does not refer to vats, it refers to vats in the image, or patterns of electronic impulses that produce vat-like appearances, and so on. Okay, well, with this in mind then, let's suppose that these brains in vats start thinking about skepticism. And so one of them, let's say, they reflect on these skeptical hypotheses, and one of them says or thinks, "I am a brain in a vat." What does this mean, right? So when one of these brains in vats says the words, "I am a brain in a vat," what exactly is she expressing? Well, if Putnam is right, what it means is something like, "I am a brain in the image, in a vat in the image." But this sentence is false, because from the point of view of the brain in the vat, it seems that it has a body, that it is in a world surrounded by objects like trees and cars and mountains. So its brain does not appear to be in a vat. Its brain appears to be in a head. So basically the brain in the vat is not hallucinating that it is a brain in a vat. It is hallucinating that it's in, a world like our world. So when it says, "I am a brain in a vat," that sentence is just false. Because what it calls brains in vats are, patterns of electronic impulses that create a kind of brain in vat-like appearance. And clearly that's not occurring. There's a general point here is that whether a sentence is true or false is going to depend on what the terms in that sentence refer to. And that's pretty uncontroversial, right? So if I say, Frank Zappa is a musician, well, you'd usually take it that Frank Zappa refers to the man who wrote albums like Joe's Garage. In that case, the sentence is true. But, you know, suppose I have a pet poodle that I've named Frank Zappa. Well, then when I say Frank Zappa is a musician, referring to my pet poodle, the sentence is false, right? So obviously, like, whether or not a sentence is true is going to depend on what the terms of the sentence refer to. And again, the key point for Putnam is that due to this causal constraint on reference, the word brain, when it is said by a brain in a vat, does not refer to biological brains, and the word vat does not refer to physical vats. Instead, brain and vat refer to specific kinds of appearances or electronic impulses, and that's why when the brain in the vat says, "I am a brain in a vat," its statement is false. Okay, so that's the situation for a brain in a vat, but what about my own situation? Well, could I be a brain in a vat? Well, the thing to notice is that what goes for these brains in vats also goes for me. If I am a brain in a vat, then when I use the words brain and vat and so on, these are referring to particular patterns of electronic impulses. The sentence, "I am a brain in a vat," is true just in case there is a pattern of electronic impulses that is creating the appearance that my brain has been envatted. But of course, that's not how things appear. Rather, it appears that my brain is in my head, that I have a body that interacts with the environment, and so on. So, the sentence, "I'm a brain in a vat," is false. So, like, if I am a brain in a vat, then the sentence, "I am a brain in a vat," is false. So the hypothesis that I'm a brain in a vat is self-refuting. We can summarize the argument like this. Premise 1, either I am a brain in a vat speaking Vatlish, or I am a non-brain in a vat speaking English. If I am a brain in a vat speaking Vatlish, then I am a brain in a vat is not true because of this causal constraint, because in that case, brain and vat refer to these patterns of electronic impulses and so on. Premise 3, if I am a non-brain in a vat speaking English, then I am a brain in a vat is not true. I mean, that's obvious, right? If I'm a non-brain in a vat and I'm speaking English, then yeah, obviously I'm not a brain in a vat. So we can conclude from this that I am a brain in a vat is not true. So conclusion, I'm not a brain in a vat. And again, that's regardless of what my circumstances are, sort of metaphysically speaking, right? The claim that I am a brain in a vat, I know that that's false. So, okay, this is one way then to run Putnam's anti-skeptical argument. So we can conclude that actually the skeptical hypothesis is in a certain sense inconceivable or self-refuting. The statement, "I'm a brain in a vat," is always false, no matter what your circumstances are, so you know that you're not a brain in a vat. There's actually a second anti-skeptical argument that we can make here. Suppose that the brain in a vat hypothesis is conceivable, and in fact suppose that it obtains. Suppose that you are in fact a brain in a vat. Well, even so, if we accept the causal constraint on reference, then most of your beliefs are still going to be true, because on this causal sort of view of reference, brains in vats have mostly true beliefs. So in the brain in the vat scenario, we don't get radical skepticism. The brain in the vat hypothesis doesn't support radical skepticism. It doesn't undermine most of our beliefs about the external world. Let's take, for instance, trees, right? Like, let's say I seem to be looking at a tree. Well, we've seen that given the causal constraint, when a brain in a vat uses the word tree, this doesn't refer to biological trees, it refers to patterns of electronic impulses that tend to produce tree-like appearances. But then even if I'm a brain in a vat, well, when I seem to be looking at a tree, and I say a sentence like, "There is a tree in front of me," well, that sentence is true, because the relevant patterns of electronic impulses are actually occurring. So my beliefs about the world, most of my everyday beliefs, are going to be true. So here's how David Chalmers summarizes this version of the argument. Premise 1, for the brain in the vat, tree refers to trees in the image. Premise 2, if for the brain in the vat, tree refers to trees in the image, then the brain in the vat statement, "There is a tree in front of me," is true. Or at least, obviously its statement, "There is a tree in front of me," is going to be true when it has the appearance of a tree in front of it. Premise 3, so if I'm a brain in a vat, then there is a tree in front of me. So conclusion, even if I can't know that I'm not a brain in a vat, that's not going to undermine most of my beliefs about the world. Most of my beliefs about the world, my everyday beliefs, are still going to be true. So it turns out then that on this point of view, both of the premises of that original skeptical argument that we saw fail. Because, first of all, you can know that you're not a brain in a vat. You can know that. The claim that you're a brain in a vat is definitely false. And moreover, even if you couldn't know that you're not a brain in a vat, that just wouldn't do anything to undermine your everyday knowledge of the external world. So, because actually most of your beliefs about the world are going to be beliefs about, like when I say there's a tree in front of me, well, that's really what you're going to be saying is that there is a tree in front of me in the image, or there is a certain pattern of electronic stimulation or something, and most of those beliefs are going to turn out to be true. Okay, well, that is Putnam's argument. Let's turn to some objections. So, first of all, we've seen that this argument rests on semantic externalism. A term refers to an object only if there's an appropriate causal connection between that term and the object. Obviously, one way to attack Putnam's argument is to attack this causal claim. Now, I'm not going to get into this in any detail here. It would require a whole other video to get into different theories of reference and meaning and so on. There's a lot that could be said here. So I just want to make a couple of very brief points, just to sort of show some initial concerns about the causal constraint here. So a first worry about the causal constraint on reference is that it has trouble accounting for our knowledge of non-causal domains. Knowledge of mathematics, of logical relationships, knowledge of moral propositions, knowledge of abstract objects in general. There are a lot of philosophers who think that numbers, for instance, are abstract objects that do not enter into causal relationships. But we can refer to numbers, we can know things about numbers. I can know, for instance, that 7 is a prime number, but there's no causal relationship between the number 7 and the symbol 7, right? Like the number 7 is this abstract object. It's sort of timeless, non-spatial. It doesn't have causal powers in itself. It's just this abstract thing, but it seems like I can still refer to it. So this is one worry we might have. Another difficulty is going to arise with non-referring terms. So think about terms like witch or unicorn, or superseded scientific theories. Caloric fluid and phlogiston. Well, all of these things are perfectly meaningful terms, but obviously the meaning of a term like witch, well, the meaning of the term witch is not going to be derived from causal interactions with witches because there are no witches. Now, of course, there are plenty of things that have causal connections to our use of the word. During the 1600s, maybe the word witch tended to be applied to, women who had mental disorders, for instance. But, I mean, obviously the word witch doesn't mean woman with mental disorder, right? So, yes, you can find like causal relationships and so on, but those causal relationships in the case of non-referring terms don't seem to be they don't seem to be kind of giving the term the meaning. So, we might worry whether Putnam's account can be extended to language in general. Or at least this sort of causal constraint, that might be too strong with respect to language in general. Okay, well, let's put this aside and just grant that the causal constraint does hold. Another objection that might occur to you is this. So, okay, granted on Putnam's view, the brain in the vat can't refer to trees because it's never entered into a causal relationship with actual trees. But even in the brain in the vat world, there are actual brains and actual vats, just by stipulation. I mean, it's a brain in a vat, right? So in that case, why shouldn't it be capable of referring to brains in vats? I mean, when it says, I am a brain in a vat, well, it can pick out brains, because it's a brain, and it can pick out vats because it's located in a vat. So there must be a whole bunch of causal relations between the brain, the vat, and the words brain and vat. So when it says, I am a brain in a vat, that should come out as true, no? Well, actually, Putnam anticipates this objection. The reason this doesn't work, according to Putnam, is that when the brain in the vat uses words like brain and vat, this usage is not caused by actual brains and actual vats, except in the sense that actual brains and actual vats cause all of its words and concepts. So the existence of a brain and a vat is a causal requirement for all of its language. The brain and the vat need to exist in order for the brain in the vat to think anything at all. So, I mean, yes, there's a causal relation between the words and the objects, but it's not enough for there to be just some causal relation. We need to have the right kind of causal relation. The cause needs to be something much more specific. So there are specific patterns of electronic impulses that produce brain-like visual appearances. When these impulses occur, the brain in the vat labels them brain rather than, tree or car or whatever. So in that case, we have a cause, like a specific pattern of electronic impulses. That cause distinguishes the term brain from the other terms that the brain in the vat uses. So that cause is what its term brain refers to. So when we think about this causal constraint, we need to find the cause that is such that it distinguishes the meaning of one word from the meaning of other words. It's not enough to just say, so like with the word brain and the brain, the actual biological brain, there is a causal relationship, but it's the same sort of causal relationship that obtains between, that it has to any other word. So it's not going to be sufficient to kind of give the meaning of the word brain. Okay, so a further objection to Putnam's argument is that even if the argument is successful, it only addresses one type of skeptical scenario. But there are other types of skeptical scenario which are not ruled out by this argument and which can play the same sort of role in the skeptical argument that we saw at the start of the video. Suppose, for example, that you were put into a vat yesterday. When you fell asleep, maybe a bunch of super powerful aliens abducted you and placed you into a vat. Or maybe the universe is controlled by an evil demon who yesterday removed you from your normal life and put you in a vat. Now, even on Putnam's view, these scenarios are totally coherent. If I were envatted yesterday, most of my life was spent interacting with the external world. So when I say brain, this refers to biological brains, and when I say vat, this refers to physical vats. And when I think to myself, I am a brain in a vat, that thought will be true, because my brain has in fact been placed in a vat. And that's the case even in terms of what my words refer to. And so, I mean, one issue here is that this type of scenario is in itself enough to set up a skeptical problem. How do you know that this scenario does not obtain? The skeptic can argue, well, if you don't know that you weren't envatted yesterday, you don't know that you have hands. But you don't know that you weren't envatted yesterday, so you don't know you have hands. And of course, there's infinite numbers of other sorts of scenarios you could tell that have a similar sort of structure to this. So actually, maybe Putnam's argument rules out one specific type of skeptical hypothesis, but it's going to leave a lot of other hypotheses on the table. Now, there's another concern here, which is, well, we might worry that the obvious conceivability of the scenario where I'm envatted yesterday, we might worry that this suggests that Putnam's argument must be going wrong somewhere, because we can now imagine extending the envatment further back into the past. So I can say, well, imagine that your brain was envatted last week, or imagine it was envatted last month, or last year, or 10 years ago, and then you sort of extend it further and further and further back until the envatment took place before you were even born. Your brain was grown in a vat right from the start. Well, at some point, this becomes inconceivable. It becomes inconceivable this scenario should obtain. Like, as you like move the envatment further and further back into the past, at some point it becomes inconceivable. But like, I mean, that's a bit strange, isn't it? Why would that happen? And at what point does that happen? I mean, can I conceive that I was envattered when I was a baby? Like maybe I had like a month of interacting with the world, or does the envatment need to have occurred after I developed language and was using words for a while? I don't know, where do you draw the line on this one? So, so think about what is being granted by Putnam's argument. First of all, Putnam is going to grant that it is a physical possibility that there could be a world in which all inhabitants have always been brains in vats. There's nothing in the laws of nature that rules that out. So I can, physical law allows for a person to have always been a brain in a vat. Moreover, I can conceive of myself that I am now a brain in a vat. That's fine. If I'm conceiving that I was envattered last week or I was envattered yesterday, that's fine. So I can conceive of myself that I'm a brain in a vat. It's just that I can't conceive of myself that I've always been a brain in a vat. I mean, there's something a bit weird about, running up to the sort of limits of conceivability at this point. It's a very strange conclusion. So we might sort of kind of challenge. So yes, you might raise the challenge of saying, well, at what point does it become inconceivable? Like, why is the line drawn at that point? And yes, so we might just find this to be a very kind of counterintuitive consequence of the argument. Okay, a final objection is that Putnam's argument, rather than refuting skepticism, actually just leads to a much more radical kind of skepticism. So in the original skeptical argument, the skeptic proposes an alternative hypothesis which would be compatible with your experiences. And the skeptic then says that we have no way of ruling out this hypothesis. If Putnam is right, then we end up being unable to tell which hypothesis our words are even expressing. So we end up with a skepticism about the very meaning of our terms. Thomas Nagel discusses the problem like this. He says, if I accept the argument, I must conclude that a brain in a vat can't think truly that it is a brain in a vat, even though others can think this about it. What follows? Only that I cannot express my skepticism by saying, perhaps I am a brain in a vat. Instead, I must say, perhaps I can't even think the truth about what I am, because I lack the necessary concepts, and my circumstances make it impossible for me to acquire them. If this doesn't qualify as skepticism, I don't know what does. So, we have a potentially much more significant skeptical challenge than what we started out with. So let's sort of explore this in a bit more detail. Suppose that Verity says the sentence, I am a brain in a vat. What does this sentence express? What proposition is being expressed by this sentence? Well, on Putnam's view, it depends on Verity's circumstances. If Verity is a normal person with a body that interacts with the world, then when she says, I am a brain in a vat, that expresses the proposition, I am a brain in a vat. Or maybe more precisely, Verity is a brain in a vat or something like that. But, that's what she's expressing, I'm a brain in a vat. If, on the other hand, Verity is a brain in a vat, then when she says the sentence, I am a brain in a vat, this expresses the proposition, I am a brain in a vat in the image, or something along those lines. Now, I can ask, how can I tell what proposition is being expressed by the sentences that I use? When I say the sentence, I am a brain in a vat, how can I know what I'm saying? Because when I say I am a brain in a vat, and when a brain in a vat says I'm a brain in a vat, we might have exactly the same qualitative mental states. We might have the same, images and words and so on running through our minds, but we're expressing very different propositions. If Putnam's argument is right, then whenever I say I am a brain in a vat, this sentence is false. So, obviously, if I'm not a brain in a vat, then it's false because, I'm not a brain in a vat. If I am a brain in a vat, it's still false, but crucially, it's expressing a different proposition. It's expressing I'm a brain in a vat in the image, which is also false. So when I say the sentence I'm a brain in a vat, regardless of what my circumstances are, it's going to turn out to be false. But depending on my circumstances, it's expressing a different proposition. So it could be expressing one of two false propositions. Okay, both propositions are false. So yes, whenever I say the sentence "I am a brain in a vat," I know that that sentence is false. But now I ask the question, well, which false proposition am I expressing? And it seems I have no way to tell. At least Putnam's argument gives me no way to tell. Basically, if Putnam is right, I know that the sentence "I'm a brain in a vat" is false, but that is not going to give me much comfort because I don't know what any of these sentences actually mean. I don't have any way of determining what language I'm speaking. So, I mean, by comparison, suppose that there's a race between two women, Verity and Delia, and you've bet a large sum of money that Verity will win the race. You're then told that the following sentence is true. She has won the race. Well, that's not going to be particularly helpful to you because you don't know whether that means that Verity has won the race or that Delia has won the race. I mean, we're kind of in a similar position here. Like, yeah, the sentence "I'm a brain in a vat" is true, but now I don't know what the proposition is that's actually being expressed by that sentence. So I kind of don't know. I mean, it feels like I'm maybe not being given the information that I'm really looking for. Okay, so there we go. That was Putnam's argument, and those were some concerns about it. And that is the end of that video. Thank you very much for watching. Goodbye.